The dust devil danced across the alkali flats, a swirling, angry thing mirroring the storm inside Sarah. It tugged at her ragged dress, tasted like ash in her mouth. She hadn't moved in what felt like days, the sun a hammer against her skull. Her throat was a rasp, her tongue thick and useless. They'd left her with a water skin, nearly empty, and a curt, "You'll be better off." Better off dead, they meant. Too tall, too hungry, a burden on a family, scratching a living from land that refused to give. She closed her eyes, welcoming the oblivion. The desert was a cruel mistress, but at least she was done with the cruelty of kin. A shadow fell across her face. She didn't bother opening her eyes. Probably just a buzzard, come to measure her for a shroud. But the shadow lingered, cool and solid. A low grunt, the creak of saddle leather, then the scent of horse sweat and something else. Something clean. Water. A voice, rough as creek gravel, rumbled. One word. No pity, no question. Just water. She managed to crack open an eyelid. A man sat astride a dun-colored horse. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, but she could see the set of his jaw, hard and weathered as the canyons carved by the Rio Grande. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either, just worn. He held out a canteen, the metal glinting in the harsh sunlight. She reached for it, her hand trembling. He didn't let go, but tilted it for her, letting the water trickle into her parched mouth. It tasted like heaven. When she'd had enough, he pulled it away, not a drop wasted. "Name?" he asked, the single word hanging in the still air. "Sarah," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He didn't ask why she was there, alone, baking under the merciless sun. He didn't need to. The desert told its own stories. He dismounted, his movements economical, betraying years spent in the saddle. He walked a slow circle around her, assessing her like he would a stray calf, not unkindly, but with a pragmatic eye. "Too far to walk," he said, stating the obvious. He looked at his horse, then back at her. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though every muscle screamed in protest. She hadn't ridden in years, not since her pa had sold their old mare to buy seed that never sprouted. He didn't offer a hand up. He simply gestured towards the horse. She pushed herself up, wincing as pain shot through her legs. She swayed, nearly falling, but caught herself. He didn't move to help, but she felt his gaze steady and unwavering like a lifeline thrown across a chasm. Finally, she managed to mount, settling awkwardly in the saddle. The horse shifted beneath her, its muscles rippling. She gripped the reins, her knuckles white. He mounted behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. He didn't touch her, but she felt the warmth of his body against her back. "Hold on," he said, and nudged the horse forward. They rode in silence, the only sound the creak of leather and the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves against the hard-packed earth. The sun beat down, relentless, but the canteen's cool water had given her strength. She glanced back at him, trying to see his face. He didn't meet her gaze. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't know where he was taking her, or why he had bothered to stop. He could have ridden on, left her to die like her family had, but he hadn't. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she saw a faint glimmer in the distance. A light, a sign of civilization, hope. A fragile thing began to bloom in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't destined to become buzzard fodder after all. He pulled the horse to a stop near a small stream. "Rest," he said, dismounting. She slid off the horse, her legs trembling. She stumbled to the stream and knelt, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. The water was cold and sweet, washing away the dust and despair. He watched her, his face still unreadable. He didn't speak, but she sensed his presence, a silent guardian in the vast, unforgiving landscape. She looked up at him, gratitude welling up inside her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. The dust devil, now a distant memory, had faded away. But the storm within her, she knew, was far from over. This silent man, this unexpected rescuer, had given her a chance, a sliver of hope, in a world that seemed determined to crush her. What she did with it, she didn't yet know. But she would try. She would live. The light hadn't been a town, not really, just a scattering of false fronts clinging to the promise of a railroad that never came. Dust choked the empty streets, swirling through broken windows and past doors hanging crooked on their hinges. A ghost town swallowed by the vastness of the desert. He dismounted in front of what was once, perhaps, a saloon. The bat-wing doors sagged inward, revealing a cavernous interior filled with shadows and the scent of decay. He didn't speak, just gestured with his head. Sarah understood. Shelter. He led the horse inside, the sound of its hooves echoing in the emptiness. The air was cooler here, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through a hole in the roof, illuminating a scattering of broken furniture and a thick layer of dust. He found a relatively clean spot near the back, by a crumbling bar. He unsaddled the horse, tethering it to a sturdy post. Then he turned to Sarah. He studied her for a moment. His eyes, finally visible in the dim light, were the color of weathered steel. They held no pity, but something else, something akin to assessment. He wasn't just seeing a waif, but gauging her mettle. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small tin and a strip of clean cloth. He gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself onto a rickety stool, wincing as pain shot through her legs. He knelt before her, his movements deliberate and economical. He didn't speak as he opened the tin, revealing a salve, pale green and smelling faintly of herbs. He gently lifted the hem of her ragged dress, revealing the scrapes and bruises that marred her legs. His touch was surprisingly gentle, considering his rough exterior. He dabbed the salve onto the wounds, his brow furrowed in concentration. She bit back a gasp as the cool ointment soothed the burning pain. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. Sarah watched him, mesmerized. She'd never experienced such quiet care, such unspoken concern. Her family had been too busy surviving to offer tenderness. When he was finished, he wrapped her legs in the clean cloth, securing it with practiced ease. He sat back on his heels, studying his work. "Rest," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Tomorrow, we ride." He stood and walked back to the horse, leaving her to absorb the quiet act of kindness. She looked down at her bandaged legs, a wave of emotion washing over her. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, mingled with a healthy dose of disbelief. He returned with a bedroll and a small bag of provisions. He laid the bedroll out on the floor, a short distance from where she sat. He offered her a piece of dried meat and a handful of dried berries. She took them gratefully, her stomach rumbling. As she ate, she watched him. He moved with a quiet grace, a man comfortable in his own skin, at home in the harsh landscape. He seemed self-sufficient, requiring nothing from anyone. A lone wolf, content to roam the wilderness. She wondered about his past, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man he was. But she didn't dare ask. He was a closed book, his secrets guarded by a lifetime of silence. After she finished eating, she lay down on the bedroll, exhaustion pulling her under. The hard floor was surprisingly comfortable. She closed her eyes, the image of his weathered face imprinted on her mind. She drifted off to sleep, lulled by the quiet rhythm of the desert wind whistling through the broken windows. For the first time in days, she felt safe, protected. She woke to the smell of coffee brewing. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. He was already up, tending to the fire he had built in a makeshift hearth. He handed her a tin cup filled with the steaming brew. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, unexpected and unsettling, shot through her. She quickly averted her gaze. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She sipped it slowly, savoring the taste. He didn't speak as he packed up the bedroll and saddled the horse. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a man accustomed to breaking camp before dawn. She watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held or where he was taking her, but she knew one thing. She trusted him, implicitly. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of approval. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her chin lifting. She wasn't just a discarded waif anymore. She was Sarah, and she was ready to face whatever the desert had in store for her, with him by her side. He offered her a hand up onto the horse. She took it, her grip firm. He mounted behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. He nudged the horse forward, and they rode out of the ghost town, leaving behind the echoes of past dreams. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light upon the vast, unforgiving landscape. The dust swirled around them, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in the West. But Sarah didn't flinch. She held on tight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart filled with a newfound hope. The desert was still a cruel mistress, but she wasn't alone anymore. And that, she realized, made all the difference. The rhythm of the ride settled into her bones, a slow, swaying cadence that mirrored the vastness around them. The desert unfolded, mile after endless mile, a tapestry of rock and scrub and sky. Sarah found her voice returning, not in a torrent, but in hesitant trickles. The silence, once oppressive, now felt like a safe harbor, a space where she could test the waters of her past without fear of judgment. She started with the small things. The name of her pa's favorite mule, Bessie, a beast as stubborn as the land itself. The way her ma used to hum while kneading dough, a wordless melody that filled their tiny cabin with a sense of warmth. Ben listened, or at least she thought he did. He never interrupted, never turned his head. His eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon, a line unwavering and sharp against the shimmering heat. Yet she sensed his presence, a silent anchor in the swirling chaos of her memories. Emboldened, she ventured further. She spoke of the droughts that had withered their crops, the gnawing hunger that had become a constant companion. She spoke of her older brother, Caleb, who had run off to join the railroad, promising to send money back, a promise that remained unfulfilled. And finally, she spoke of the words that had driven her away, the harsh pronouncements of her aunt, a woman with a heart as dry as the desert sand. Too tall, too hungry, a burden. As she spoke, she felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were recounting someone else's life. The pain was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was muted, distanced by the miles they had traveled and the silent presence of the man beside her. He didn't offer platitudes, didn't tell her everything would be all right. He simply kept riding, his silence a balm to her wounded spirit. She suspected he knew what it was to carry a burden, to be judged, and found wanting. She saw it in the set of his jaw, the weariness etched around his eyes. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat, barren plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with scrub pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A small, dilapidated building, its paint peeling, its windows boarded up. An old schoolhouse. "That used to be Willow Creek School," she said, her voice catching in her throat. I always wanted to be a teacher." He slowed the horse, pulling it to a stop a short distance from the building. He dismounted, his movements as economical as ever. He didn't say a word, just stood there, his gaze fixed on the schoolhouse. Sarah slid off the horse, her legs still stiff and sore. She walked towards the building, drawn by an invisible force. She ran a hand along the weathered wood, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. The schoolhouse was a ruin, a testament to the fleeting nature of dreams. But in her mind's eye, she could see it, as it once was, filled with the laughter of children, the smell of chalk dust, and the promise of a brighter future. She could see herself standing at the front of the room, her voice clear and strong, guiding young minds towards knowledge and understanding. She walked to one of the boarded-up windows and peered inside. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with cobwebs and debris, but she could still make out the outlines of desks and chairs, the remnants of a blackboard, and a tattered map of the United States. A wave of sadness washed over her, a profound sense of loss for the life she had never had. The dream of becoming a teacher, once so vibrant and alive, now seemed like a distant memory, a cruel joke played by fate. She turned away from the window, her shoulders slumped. She didn't notice Ben until he was standing beside her. He didn't speak, but he reached out and gently touched her arm. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. He pointed to the schoolhouse, then to her. The message was clear. The dream wasn't dead, not entirely. It was buried, perhaps, beneath layers of dust and disappointment, but it was still there, waiting to be resurrected. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. He simply held her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm too old, too broken." He shook his head, a barely perceptible movement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. He placed it in her hand, closing her fingers around it. The stone was warm and smooth, a tangible reminder of his presence, his support. She looked at it, then back at him. "What's this for?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, but she understood. The stone was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, beauty and resilience could be found. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that someone believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. She clutched the stone tightly in her hand, her heart swelling with gratitude. She looked at the schoolhouse again, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. It might be a ruin, but it was still standing. And so was she. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to rebuild. Maybe, with his help, she could resurrect her dream. He nodded, as if reading her thoughts. He turned and walked back to the horse, leaving her to contemplate her future. She stood there for a long time, gazing at the schoolhouse, the stone warm in her hand. The desert wind whispered around her, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a new beginning. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she wasn't afraid. She had a purpose now, a reason to keep going, and she had him, the silent man who had saved her life, and perhaps her soul. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and gold. It was time to move on. She took one last look at the schoolhouse, then turned and walked back to the horse. She mounted behind him, her body pressed against his. He nudged the horse forward and they rode away, leaving the old schoolhouse behind. but the dream of becoming a teacher she knew would stay with her always, a flickering ember waiting to be rekindled. The stone in her hand felt like a promise. The ride continued, the setting sun casting long skeletal shadows that stretched and distorted the landscape. Sarah, nestled behind Ben, felt the familiar rhythm of the horse beneath them, a steady heartbeat in the vast stillness. The air grew colder, and she shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Ben didn't acknowledge her discomfort, but a few minutes later he stopped the horse near a cluster of scrub brush. He dismounted and, with swift, practiced movements, gathered some dry branches and started a small fire. The flames crackled and danced, casting a warm glow on their faces. Sarah watched him, her heart filled with a quiet gratitude. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. As the fire burned brighter, casting flickering shadows, Ben reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small tin plate and a piece of jerky, offering them to Sarah. She took them gratefully, her stomach rumbling. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. After they finished eating, Ben leaned back against his saddle, staring into the flames. Sarah watched him, her curiosity piqued. She knew so little about him, about his past, about the reasons he had chosen to live such a solitary life. She longed to ask him questions, to unravel the mysteries that lay hidden beneath his stoic exterior. But she hesitated, afraid of intruding, of shattering the fragile peace that had settled between them. Then, as he shifted slightly, something fell from his saddlebag, landing softly on the ground. It was a photograph, encased in a small leather frame, worn and creased with age. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw it. It was a picture of a woman and a child. The woman was young, with a bright smile and kind eyes. She was holding a small child, a girl who looked to be about 3 or 4 years old. The girl had her mother's eyes and a mischievous grin. They were standing in front of a small wooden house, surrounded by a field of wildflowers. It was a scene of idyllic domesticity, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the desert landscape. Sarah quickly averted her gaze, feeling a pang of guilt for intruding on something so personal. She knew instinctively that the photograph was precious to him, a window into a past he rarely, if ever, spoke about. Ben didn't seem to notice that she had seen it. He continued to stare into the flames, his face unreadable. Sarah wondered who the woman and child were. His wife? His daughter? What had happened to them? Why was he alone now, haunted by the ghosts of his past? She wanted to ask him, to offer him comfort, but the words caught in her throat. She knew that some wounds were too deep to be healed, some sorrows too profound to be shared, and she sensed that Ben's silence was a shield, a way of protecting himself from the pain that still lingered within him. She picked up a small twig and tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not anymore. It was a shared silence, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried, the losses they had both endured. She glanced at Ben again, her heart aching for him. She knew that she couldn't erase his past, couldn't bring back the people he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, she could offer him a glimpse of hope, a reason to believe in the future. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her fingers brushing against his weathered skin. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply turned his head and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. She didn't say anything, just held his gaze, letting her eyes convey the sympathy and understanding she couldn't express in words. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her silent message. Then he turned back to the fire, his face still unreadable. She knew that she would never know the full story of his past, that some secrets would remain buried forever. But she didn't need to know everything. She knew enough. She knew that he was a good man, a kind man, a man who had suffered greatly. And she knew that she was grateful to have him in her life, even if it was only for a short time. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks flying into the night sky. The stars twinkled above them like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. The desert wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a new day. Sarah leaned back against her saddle, closing her eyes. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. She was still lost, still uncertain about her future. But she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The photograph remained on the ground, a silent testament to the complexities of life, the enduring power of love, and the enduring pain of loss. It was a reminder that everyone carried a story, a burden, a secret sorrow. And it was a reminder that even in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West, compassion and connection could still be found. Ben eventually picked up the picture, carefully wiping the dust from the glass before placing it back in the safety of his saddlebag. A silent act of remembrance, a private moment of grief acknowledged only by the flickering firelight and the watchful stars. Sarah knew, without a word being spoken, that the space between them had deepened, not with shared history, but with mutual respect for histories unseen. The fire had burned low, embers glowing like watchful eyes in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah stirred, the chill seeping into her bones, despite the thin blanket. Ben was already awake, his silhouette a dark sentinel against the lightening sky. He moved with his usual quiet efficiency, packing their meager belongings, extinguishing the remnants of the fire. She watched him, the memory of the photograph still fresh in her mind. The weight of his unspoken sorrow seemed to hang heavy in the air, a tangible presence that mirrored the vastness of the desert. She wanted to offer him solace, but the words remained trapped in her throat. Some wounds, she knew, were best left untouched. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, they mounted the horse and continued their journey. The landscape stretched before them, an endless expanse of scrub brush and rocky terrain. Sarah clung to Ben, finding a strange comfort in his solid presence. They rode for hours, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape, but a growing sense of unease gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Around midday, as they approached a narrow canyon, she saw them, a group of riders, silhouetted against the sun, their figures ominous and menacing. There were 4 of them, mounted on heavily armed horses, their faces grim and determined. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She instinctively knew who they were, bounty hunters, and they were after her. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He didn't say a word, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. He pulled the horse to a halt, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle strapped to his saddle. The bounty hunters approached slowly, their leader, a man with a cruel face and a scar that ran down his cheek, riding in the front. He wore a worn leather duster and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his eyes. His name, she remembered, with a shiver, was Jed. "Well, well," Jed said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Looks like we found ourselves a little stray." He grinned, a chilling display of yellowed teeth. And her protector, Ben, remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He held the reins loosely, his body relaxed, but Sarah knew he was ready for anything. "We know who you are, Sarah," Jed continued, his eyes fixed on her. "We know about the inheritance, and we know you're running from your obligations." Sarah swallowed hard, her fear palpable. She had hoped to outrun them, to disappear into the vastness of the desert, but they had found her, and now she knew her past was about to catch up with her. "She ain't done nothing," Ben finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Leave her be." Jed laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "That ain't up to you, old man. She owes a debt, and debt's got to be paid." He gestured to his men who spread out, surrounding them. "Now, hand her over, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you ride away." Ben didn't move. His eyes, cold as steel, remained fixed on Jed. He slowly raised his rifle, the movement deliberate and menacing. "I ain't gonna ask you again," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Turn around, right away." Jed's grin widened. "You gonna shoot us, old man?" "You and what army?" He nodded to his men. "Take 'em down." The bounty hunters surged forward, their guns drawn. Ben reacted instantly, firing his rifle with deadly accuracy. One of the bounty hunters cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his arm. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Sarah ducked behind Ben, her heart pounding in her chest. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of men. Ben fought with a ferocity that surprised her. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his age, picking off the bounty hunters one by one. But they were too many, and they were closing in. Sarah knew that they couldn't win. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the canyon. She had to do something, anything, to save them. As Jed advanced, a pistol aimed directly at Ben, Sarah made a decision. She pushed herself off the horse, landing hard on the rocky ground. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the canyon. "Stop! I'll go with you." Ben turned to her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Sarah, no." "It's the only way," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't let you die for me." Jed grinned, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Smart girl," he said. "Now drop the rifle, old man, and let's get this over with." Ben hesitated, his gaze shifting between Sarah and Jed. He knew that she was right. He couldn't protect her, not against these odds. With a sigh of resignation, he lowered his rifle, letting it fall to the ground. Jed dismounted and approached Sarah, grabbing her arm roughly. "Let's go," he said, his grip tight. "We got a long ride ahead of us." As they led her away, Sarah looked back at Ben, her eyes filled with tears. He stood there, his silhouette a lonely figure in the canyon, his face etched with despair. She wanted to tell him that she would be all right, that she would find a way to escape. But the words wouldn't come. She knew that she was walking into the unknown, into a future filled with uncertainty and danger. But she also knew that she had made the right decision. She had saved his life. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. The stone still clutched tight in her hand, a cold comfort against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The fight, she knew, was far from over. The dust swirled around Sarah as Jed dragged her toward his horse. The canyon echoed with the groans of the wounded, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the air. She risked another glance at Ben. He hadn't moved, his posture defeated, the rifle lying uselessly at his feet, but something in his eyes flickered, a spark beneath the ashes of despair. It wasn't resignation she saw, but a cold, calculating assessment. Jed hauled her onto the back of his horse, her wrists burning from his brutal grip. As he swung himself up behind her, she braced for the jolting ride, the inevitable journey back to whatever bleak fate awaited her. But it never came. A shot rang out, sharp and precise. Jed grunted, his grip loosening. He clawed at his shoulder, a crimson stain blossoming on his duster. He roared in pain and fury, turning in the saddle, his pistol raised. "You old fool!" he bellowed at Ben. "You want to die that bad?" Ben didn't answer. He had retrieved his rifle, his movements fluid and practiced, a stark contrast to the weary slump he'd displayed moments before. He wasn't aiming to kill. Sarah could see it in the controlled intensity of his gaze. He was aiming to disable. Another shot. Jed's pistol flew from his hand, clattering against the rocks. He howled again, clutching his wrist. Ben's movements were economical, almost graceful. He fired again, striking the lead horse of the remaining bounty hunters. The animal reared in panic, throwing its rider. The canyon dissolved into chaos. Sarah, taking advantage of Jed's distraction and the confusion around them, twisted in his grasp and kicked him hard in the gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, and she scrambled off the horse, landing awkwardly but free. She watched in stunned silence as Ben, a whirlwind of controlled violence, systematically disarmed and incapacitated the remaining bounty hunters. He didn't kill them. He shot to wound, to disable, to prevent them from pursuing. A shot to the knee, another to the shoulder, a third that sent a hat flying. Each shot was precise, calculated, delivered with a chilling efficiency. It was over in a matter of minutes. The bounty hunters lay groaning on the ground, their weapons scattered, their horses skittish and restless. Jed, still clutching his shoulder and wrist, glared at Ben with venomous hatred. "You ain't seen the last of this, old man," he spat. "I'll be back, and next time, I'm going to kill you both." Ben leveled his rifle at Jed, his face impassive. "Get out of here," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." Jed, despite his bravado, recognized the deadly intent in Ben's eyes. He knew he was outmatched, at least for now. He scrambled onto a horse, his movements clumsy and painful, and rode away, his remaining men following close behind. As the dust settled, Sarah stared at Ben, her mind reeling. She had seen a glimpse of something she hadn't expected, a hidden skill, a buried past. He wasn't just a quiet rancher, a solitary wanderer. He was something more, something dangerous. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ben lowered his rifle, his face returning to its familiar impassivity. He didn't answer, didn't offer an explanation. He simply reloaded his rifle and strapped it back onto his saddle. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice flat. "They'll be back, and next time they'll be better prepared." He turned and walked towards the horses, his movements betraying a slight limp she hadn't noticed before. Sarah followed him, her mind racing. She knew that she couldn't let it go, that she needed to understand who this man was, what secrets he was hiding. As they rode away from the canyon, leaving the wounded bounty hunters behind, she pressed him again. "Who are you, Ben? What did you do?" He remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice low. "It was a long time ago. Another life. But it does matter," Sarah insisted. "I need to know who I'm traveling with. I need to know if I can trust you." He stopped the horse, turning to face her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a profound sadness. "Trust is earned, Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "Not given." He hesitated, as if struggling with a difficult decision. Then he took a deep breath and began to speak, his words hesitant at first, then gaining momentum as he delved into the past. "I was a lawman," he said, his voice barely audible. "A U.S. Marshal. Back in Kansas?" He paused, as if waiting for her reaction. Sarah simply nodded, urging him to continue. "I was good at my job," he said, his voice flat. "Too good, maybe. I brought down a lot of bad men, made a lot of enemies." He fell silent again, his gaze distant. Sarah could see the pain etched on his face, the weight of the memories he carried. "One day," he continued, his voice trembling slightly, "they came after me. Not in a fair fight. They came after my family." His voice cracked, and he stopped, unable to continue. Sarah reached out and gently touched his arm, offering him silent support. He took a deep breath and continued, his voice barely a whisper. "My wife, my daughter, they were gone." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Sarah's heart ached for him. She understood now, the silence, the solitude, the haunted look in his eyes. He wasn't just running from the world. He was running from his past, from the ghosts that haunted him. "I quit the Marshal Service," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "I couldn't stay. Everywhere I looked, I saw them. Everywhere I went, I felt their absence." He paused, his gaze returning to Sarah. "I came out here to disappear," he said, "to forget. But some things you can never forget." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "Now you know," he said. "Now you know who I am. You can still leave. I wouldn't blame you." Sarah looked at him, her heart filled with compassion. She knew that he was a broken man, haunted by his past. But she also knew that he was a good man, a man of honor and integrity. And she knew that she wasn't afraid of him. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I'm not going anywhere, Ben," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I trust you." He looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. He squeezed her hand tightly, his gratitude unspoken. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you, Sarah." He released her hand and turned back to the horse, his posture a little straighter, his face a little less burdened. They rode on in silence, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert. But the silence was different now. It was a silence of understanding, of shared burdens, of a growing trust. Sarah knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Ben, and he had her. And together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The stone in her hand felt warmer now, a symbol not just of hope, but of a burgeoning connection that promised to reshape both their lives. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. Ben urged the horse onward, his gaze scanning the desolate landscape. He knew Jed wouldn't give up easily. Men like that, driven by greed and fueled by pride, were relentless. They needed shelter, and fast. Up ahead, a cluster of dilapidated buildings clung to the side of a rocky outcrop. The ghost town of redemption. A saloon, its swinging doors creaking in the wind, still stood, a skeletal reminder of a town that had once been. It was their only option. "We'll make our stand there," Ben said, pointing towards the saloon. "It's defensible." Sarah looked at the saloon, its darkened windows like empty eye sockets. It looked more like a tomb than a sanctuary. But she knew Ben was right. They had no choice. They rode into redemption, the only sound the clatter of the horses' hooves on the dusty street. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the mournful howls of the wind. Ben dismounted, his rifle in hand, and surveyed the town. It was deserted, the buildings crumbling, the windows boarded up. But it was also eerily beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. "Stay close," Ben said, his voice low, "and keep your eyes open." He led the way to the saloon, pushing open the creaking doors. The interior was dark and dusty, the air thick with the scent of decay. The bar, its surface scarred and stained, still stood, a silent witness to countless nights of revelry and despair. Broken bottles littered the floor, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like macabre decorations. "Not exactly the Ritz," Sarah said, trying to inject a bit of humor into the grim situation. Ben didn't smile. "It'll do," he said. "We need to barricade the doors and windows." He set to work, moving with a quiet efficiency. He used tables and chairs to block the doors, reinforcing them with whatever debris he could find. Sarah helped him, her fear momentarily forgotten in the face of the immediate danger. As they worked, Ben explained his plan. "They'll come at first light," he said. "They'll try to rush us. We need to be ready." He showed her how to load and fire the rifle, explaining the importance of accuracy and conservation of ammunition. Sarah listened intently, her hands trembling slightly as she handled the weapon. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew that her life depended on it. "You have to be calm," Ben said, his voice firm but gentle. "You have to focus. Don't let your fear control you." He showed her how to aim, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger. He made her practice, firing at empty bottles and rusted cans. To his surprise, she was a quick learner. She had a natural steadiness, a quiet determination that belied her initial fear. As the night wore on, they continued to fortify the saloon using every available resource. They boarded up the windows, creating makeshift loopholes for firing. They gathered water from a nearby well, storing it in empty whiskey bottles. They prepared for the siege. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked, as they sat huddled by a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "You don't owe me anything. You could have just left me to them." Ben looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "I couldn't," he said, his voice low. "I made a promise." "A promise to who?" Sarah asked. Ben hesitated, his gaze shifting to the fire. "To myself," he said. "A long time ago, I made a promise to myself that I would never stand by and watch injustice happen, that I would always stand up for the helpless." He paused, his face etched with pain. "I failed once," he said. "I won't fail again." Sarah looked at him, her heart filled with admiration and gratitude. She understood now. He wasn't just protecting her. He was redeeming himself. He was trying to atone for the mistakes of his past. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Ben." He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the mournful howl of the wind. As the night deepened, Ben began to teach Sarah some basic self-defense techniques. He showed her how to use her weight and leverage to her advantage, how to strike vulnerable points, how to disarm an attacker. Sarah was surprised by her own strength and agility. She had always seen herself as weak and helpless, but Ben was showing her that she was capable of much more than she thought. "You have to be confident," Ben said, as they practiced a disarming maneuver. "You have to believe in yourself. You have to be willing to fight." He saw a flicker of defiance ignite within her, a spark of determination that surpassed her initial despair. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a growing resilience, a quiet strength. The confined space of the saloon intensified the threat, forcing them to rely on each other. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. They were trapped, isolated, and vulnerable, but they were also together. And that, Sarah realized, was their greatest strength. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, they took their positions. Ben stood by the front door, his rifle ready. Sarah stood by the window, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the rifle. They waited, their hearts pounding in their chests, for the inevitable arrival of Jed and his men. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Then, in the distance, they heard it. The sound of horses' hooves, growing louder with each passing moment. Jed was coming, and redemption was about to live up to its name. The stone in Sarah's pocket felt heavy, a cold reminder of what she was fighting for, not just her life, but her future, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption of her own. The first rays of dawn kissed the horizon, painting the desolate landscape in a pale, ethereal glow. The silence was a taut string pulled to breaking, the air thick with anticipation. Ben stood braced by the door, rifle clutched in his weathered hands, a statue carved from granite and grit. Sarah watched from the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the rifle, the cold steel a stark contrast to the sweat on her palms. Then the telltale rumble, low and guttural, that grew into the unmistakable thunder of approaching hooves. They were coming. Ben nodded, his eyes steely. "Get ready," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the pounding of Sarah's heart. The riders emerged from the swirling dust, silhouetted against the rising sun. Jed, his arm in a makeshift sling, led the charge, his face a mask of fury and determination. Behind him, the remaining bounty hunters fanned out, their rifles raised, their eyes fixed on the saloon. "Come out, you old fool!" Jed bellowed, his voice echoing across the deserted street. "Hand over the woman, and maybe I'll let you live." Ben didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle, taking aim. "This is your last chance," Jed yelled. "Don't make me do this." Still, no response. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Jed could bear it no longer. "Fire!" he screamed, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. Bullets ripped through the air, splintering the wood of the saloon, shattering the windows. Sarah ducked behind the bar, her ears ringing, her body trembling. Ben returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. One of the bounty hunters cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his chest. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of death and desperation. Ben moved with a speed and agility that defied his age, picking off the bounty hunters, one by one. But they were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Sarah, remembering Ben's instructions, peered through the loophole, taking aim. Her hands shook, her heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked in her hands, the recoil jarring her shoulder. She opened her eyes and saw one of the bounty hunters slump in his saddle, his rifle falling to the ground. She had hit him. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins, replacing her fear with a cold, hard determination. She reloaded the rifle and fired again and again, her shots becoming more accurate with each passing moment. The bounty hunters, surprised by her unexpected resistance, began to falter. They had expected an easy victory, but they were facing a formidable opponent. Jed, realizing that his plan was failing, dismounted and charged towards the saloon, his pistol raised. He kicked open the door and burst inside, his eyes blazing with fury. Ben, anticipating his move, whirled around and fired, the bullet grazing Jed's cheek. Jed stumbled, momentarily stunned, giving Ben the opportunity to close the distance. They grappled, a desperate struggle for survival. Jed was younger and stronger, but Ben was more experienced, more skilled. They wrestled, punching and kicking, their bodies slamming against the bar, sending bottles crashing to the floor. Sarah, seeing Ben in danger, rushed forward, grabbing a broken bottle from the floor. She hesitated for a moment, her conscience warring with her survival instinct. But then she saw Jed raise his pistol, aiming it at Ben's head. Without thinking, she lunged forward and smashed the bottle against Jed's skull. Jed screamed and collapsed, his body twitching on the floor. The remaining bounty hunters, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve and retreated, scattering into the desert. The silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the ragged breathing of Ben and Sarah. Ben staggered to his feet, his face bruised and bloody, his body aching. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, her body trembling, her mind still reeling from the violence. I think so, she said. Ben examined her carefully, checking for injuries. He found a small cut on her arm where a bullet had grazed her. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said, leading her to the back room of the saloon. As darkness descended, casting long, eerie shadows across the ghost town, Sarah tended to Ben's wounds. The flickering light of the campfire danced across their faces, revealing the raw emotions that lay beneath the surface. "You were incredible out there," Ben said, wincing as Sarah cleaned a gash on his arm. "I never would have guessed you had it in you." Sarah shrugged, her gaze averted. "I was just trying to survive," she said. "There's more to it than that," Ben said, his voice gentle. "You were fighting for something. For yourself. For your future." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I saw a strength in you tonight, Sarah," he said. "A resilience that I admire." Sarah blushed, uncomfortable with his praise. She had never been admired before. She had always been seen as weak, as vulnerable. "Why did you leave your family?" she asked, changing the subject. "Back in Kansas. Why did you leave them?" Ben's face clouded over, his eyes filled with pain. He sighed, a sound heavy with regret. "I didn't leave them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I protected them." He hesitated, as if struggling with a difficult confession. "I was making too many enemies," he said. "My work as a marshal, it was dangerous. I knew that if I stayed, they would be in danger. So I left. I thought I was protecting them." His voice cracked, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "But it didn't work," he said, his voice trembling. "They found them anyway." Sarah reached out and gently touched his hand, offering him silent comfort. She understood now. The guilt, the pain, the self-blame. He had been carrying it all for so long. "I'm so sorry, Ben," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I should have stayed," he said. "I should have protected them. I failed them." "You didn't fail them," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You did what you thought was best. You can't blame yourself." He shook his head, his face etched with grief. "I can't forgive myself," he said. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Sarah squeezed his hand, offering him what little solace she could. "It's not your fault, Ben," she said again, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. He squeezed her hand tightly, his gratitude unspoken. The campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and the unspoken longing that hung between them. They were two broken souls, bound together by fate, seeking solace in each other's company. The stone in Sarah's pocket felt smooth and warm, a silent promise of a future, however uncertain, that they would face together. The night was far from over, but in the shared silence, a fragile hope began to bloom. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the snapping fire. Ben stared into the flames, his mind working, calculating angles, assessing risks. He knew Jed wouldn't give up. He'd lick his wounds, regroup, and come back, probably with more men, maybe even a posse. They needed to disappear, and fast. He looked at Sarah, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes holding a newfound strength. He saw a flicker of the woman she could become, the woman she was already becoming. He knew he couldn't fail her. "We can't stay here," he said, breaking the silence. "They'll be back, and next time, they'll be ready." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on him. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. Ben stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, howling through the deserted streets. whipping sand against the boarded-up windows. Dark clouds gathered overhead, obscuring the moon and stars. A storm was brewing. "We're going to use the storm to our advantage," he said, his voice low. "It'll give us cover." He turned back to Sarah, his eyes filled with a spark of determination. "There's an old mine shaft about a mile north of here," he said. "It's abandoned, but it leads to a network of tunnels that run through the mountains. I used to explore them as a kid." Sarah listened intently, her mind racing. "You think we can get through them?" she asked. "It's our best chance," Ben said. "It'll be dangerous, but it's better than waiting here to be slaughtered." He explained his plan, detailing every step, every risk. They would wait until the storm reached its peak, using the wind and rain to mask their movements. They would leave the horses behind, traveling on foot, moving quickly and quietly. They would follow the dry creek bed to the entrance of the mine, then navigate the tunnels to the other side of the mountains. Sarah listened, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a daring plan, a desperate gamble, but she trusted Ben. She had seen his skill, his courage, his unwavering determination, and she knew that he wouldn't lead her astray. "I'm with you," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do it." Ben nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He began to gather their supplies, packing water, food, and ammunition into a small satchel. He checked their weapons, ensuring that they were clean and loaded. He was meticulous, methodical, leaving nothing to chance. As the storm raged outside, they prepared for their escape. The wind howled, rattling the windows. The rain lashed against the walls, creating a deafening roar. The saloon creaked and groaned, as if protesting their departure. When the storm reached its crescendo, Ben signaled that it was time to go. He extinguished the fire, plunging the saloon into darkness. He led Sarah to the back door, his hand firmly gripping hers. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "And don't make a sound." He pushed open the door, and they stepped out into the storm. The wind tore at them, whipping their hair and clothes. The rain stung their faces, blinding them. They stumbled forward, their bodies buffeted by the elements. Ben led the way, his senses heightened, his instincts guiding him through the darkness. He knew the terrain intimately, every rock, every crevice, every dip in the land. He moved with a sure-footedness that defied the treacherous conditions. Sarah followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she refused to show it. She focused on Ben, trusting him to lead her to safety. She stumbled and fell several times, but she got back up each time, her determination unwavering. They reached the dry creek bed, and Ben led her down into its rocky depths. The wind howled overhead, but the creek bed offered some protection from the storm. They moved quickly, their feet slipping on the wet stones, their bodies soaked to the bone. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the entrance to the mine. It was a dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain, hidden behind a thick curtain of rain. The air around it was cold and damp, carrying the musty scent of decay. Ben paused, taking a deep breath. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Are you ready?" Sarah looked at the mine, its darkness promising unknown dangers. She hesitated for a moment, her fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then she looked at Ben, his eyes filled with unwavering determination, and she knew that she couldn't back down. "Ready," she said, her voice firm. Ben nodded, his hand tightening on hers. He led her into the mine, plunging them into darkness. The air inside was thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the dripping of water and the echo of their footsteps. They moved slowly, cautiously, feeling their way through the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and winding, the walls damp and slimy. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. As they ventured deeper into the mine, Sarah's fear began to subside. She focused on Ben, trusting him to guide her through the darkness. She listened to his instructions, following his lead, her confidence growing with each step. They encountered obstacles along the way: collapsed tunnels, flooded passageways, treacherous drops. But they overcame them all, working together, relying on each other's strength and courage. Ben's knowledge of the tunnels proved invaluable. He knew the shortcuts, the hidden passages, the safest routes. He guided them through the labyrinthine network, avoiding the pitfalls and dangers that lay hidden in the darkness. After hours of relentless travel, they finally reached the other side of the mountains. They emerged from the mine into a world transformed by the storm. The sky was clear, the stars were shining, the air was fresh and clean. They had made it. They had escaped. Sarah looked at Ben, her heart filled with gratitude and admiration. He had saved her life. He had given her hope. He had shown her the strength that lay hidden within her. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He smiled, a rare and precious sight. "We did it," he said, his voice soft. "We made it." They stood there for a moment, bathed in the moonlight, their bodies aching, their spirits soaring. They were free. For now. The stone in Sarah's pocket felt light, almost buoyant, a symbol of the newfound freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. But Ben knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Jed would be back. This was just the beginning. The hard-won freedom felt fragile, a momentary reprieve in a relentless chase. Ben knew Jed's kind. They were like ticks, tenacious, bloodthirsty, and impossible to shake. He scanned the horizon, his senses on high alert, already planning their next move. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be tracking us." Sarah nodded, her gaze following his. The landscape was unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert broken only by jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. The storm had washed away their tracks, but Jed wouldn't be deterred. He'd have bloodhounds, trackers, men who could smell fear a mile away. "Where to?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the weariness etched on her face. Ben pointed towards the west, where a ribbon of silver snaked through the distant hills. "The Rio Grande," he said. "If we can cross it, we'll be in Mexico. They won't follow us there." The Rio Grande, the big river. It represented a border, a sanctuary, a new beginning. But it also represented a formidable obstacle, especially after the storm. They started walking, their pace brisk and determined. The sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving, turning the desert into a furnace. Their water supply was dwindling, and their bodies were aching, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their lives depended on it. As they approached the river, they could hear the roar of the water, a deafening symphony of power and fury. The storm had transformed the Rio Grande into a raging torrent, a churning mass of mud and debris. The current was swift and treacherous, the banks eroded and unstable. Ben stopped at the edge of the river, his face grim. He surveyed the scene, assessing the risks. The crossing would be difficult, dangerous, perhaps even impossible, but they had no choice. "This is going to be tough," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the water. "We need to find a shallow spot, a place where we can cross without being swept away." They walked along the bank, searching for a suitable crossing point. But the river was wide and deep, the current swift and unrelenting. They searched for hours, their hope dwindling with each passing moment. Finally, they found a place where the river narrowed, where a series of large rocks jutted out of the water, forming a natural stepping stone path. It was still dangerous, but it was their only option. "This is it," Ben said, his voice tight with apprehension. "We'll have to take it slow and steady. One wrong step, and we're done for." He tested the water, his face grimacing, as the icy current swirled around his legs. The rocks were slippery and uneven, the current pulling at him with relentless force. He struggled to maintain his balance, his muscles straining against the relentless pressure. "It's strong," he said, his voice strained. "Be careful." He started across, his movements deliberate and cautious. He stepped from rock to rock, testing each one before committing his weight. The current buffeted him, threatening to knock him off balance. But he persevered, his determination unwavering. He reached the middle of the river, where the current was at its strongest. He stumbled, his foot slipping on a wet rock. He gasped, his arms flailing as he struggled to regain his balance. Sarah watched from the bank, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Ben struggling, his body being swept downstream. She knew that if he fell, he would be lost. Without hesitation, she plunged into the river, her body instantly assaulted by the icy water and the relentless current. She struggled to stay afloat, her arms and legs churning, her lungs burning. She reached Ben, grabbing his arm, pulling him towards her. He was heavy, exhausted, barely able to hold on, but she refused to let go. "Hold on," she yelled, her voice strained. "I've got you." She used her height and her strength to her advantage, bracing herself against the current, using her long legs to find purchase on the slippery rocks. She pulled Ben towards her, inch by inch, her muscles screaming in protest. Together, they fought against the river, their bodies battered and bruised, their spirits tested to the limit. They stumbled and slipped, but they refused to give up. They held on to each other, drawing strength from each other's presence. Finally, they reached the other side of the river, collapsing onto the bank, exhausted and breathless. They lay there for a moment, catching their breath, their bodies trembling with fatigue. They had made it. They had crossed the Rio Grande. They were in Mexico. Ben looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. She had saved his life. She had shown him her strength, her courage, her unwavering determination. "I owe you one," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah smiled, her face radiant despite the dirt and exhaustion. "We're even," she said. "You saved my life back in Redemption." They stood up, their bodies aching, their spirits renewed. They had faced the river. They had conquered its power. They had emerged stronger than before. The stone in Sarah's pocket, wet but secure, felt like a badge of honor, a testament to the strength she never knew she possessed. As they walked away from the river, heading deeper into Mexico, Ben knew that they still had a long way to go. Jed would still be hunting them. But they had crossed a major hurdle, a significant boundary. They had proven to themselves that they could overcome any obstacle, that they could survive against all odds. And that, he knew, was a victory worth celebrating. The Rio Grande, now behind them, roared on, a testament to the power of nature, a mirror to the resilience they had found within themselves. The dust devils danced across the Mexican plains, mirroring the turmoil in Jed's soul. The Rio Grande had been a setback, a stinging humiliation, but it hadn't quenched the fire of his obsession. He tasted blood, not from the graze Ben had given him, but from the simmering rage that consumed him. Sarah. She was more than just a debt to be collected. She was a prize, a symbol of dominance, and Ben was standing in his way. He spurred his horse onward, the animal lathered and exhausted, a testament to Jed's relentless pursuit. The bounty hunters he'd managed to scrape together after the fiasco in Redemption were a sorry lot, scared, greedy, and itching for the easy score that had eluded them. He kept them in line with threats and the promise of a hefty payout, but he knew their loyalty was as thin as the desert air. Jed pulled up, squinting at the ground. The tracks were faint, almost invisible against the hard-packed earth, but they were there. Ben and the woman, heading south. He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. They wouldn't get far. He barked orders at his men, his voice raw with frustration. "Spread out. Find any sign of them. I want that woman alive. Ben. Well, Ben's another story." The glint in his eyes spoke volumes. Days blurred into a relentless cycle of tracking, riding, and cursing. The Mexican landscape offered no respite, its harsh beauty a constant reminder of their dwindling resources. Jed's obsession grew with each passing mile, twisting his features into a grotesque mask of determination. He barely slept, fueled by coffee and the burning need to possess Sarah. He envisioned her face, not as he'd seen it in Redemption, defiant, scared, but with a spark of courage he couldn't deny. But as he wanted Hunt to see it, compliant, grateful, broken. He saw himself as her savior, rescuing her from the harsh realities of the West, conveniently ignoring the fact that he was the one creating those realities. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and violet, one of Jed's men rode back, his face pale with fear. "Boss," he stammered, "we found something." Jed followed him to a small, abandoned shack, its walls crumbling, its roof caved in. Inside, lying on the dirt floor, was a discarded piece of fabric, a torn piece of Sarah's dress. Jed picked it up, his fingers tracing the delicate pattern. He inhaled deeply, imagining he could still smell her scent, but it was what lay beside the fabric that sent a shiver down his spine. A small, carefully constructed cairn of stones, and on top of the cairn, a single black feather. Jed knew what it meant. It was a message, a warning. He remembered the stories he'd heard about Ben, whispers from men who'd crossed him, men who'd learned the hard way that beneath the quiet exterior lay a cunning and ruthless fighter. They said he had a connection to the land, an almost uncanny ability to disappear and reappear at will. They said he was like a ghost, a shadow in the desert. Jed scoffed. Superstition, fear-mongering. But a seed of doubt had been planted, a nagging feeling that he was playing a game he didn't fully understand. He clenched his fist, crushing the piece of fabric in his hand. He wouldn't be deterred. He wouldn't be intimidated. He would find Sarah, and he would make Ben pay. He turned to his men, his voice cold and hard. "We ride at dawn. I want every inch of this territory searched. Leave no stone unturned. And if you see Ben, you kill him. Understand?" The men nodded, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They knew Jed was on the edge, that he was driven by something more than just money. They knew that crossing him was a death sentence. As the night wore on, Jed sat alone by the campfire, staring into the flames. He saw Sarah's face in the flickering light, her eyes pleading, her lips whispering his name. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the air, desperate to touch her. He was so close. He could feel it. He could taste it. He would have her. He would break her spirit. He would make her his. And Ben would suffer. He would suffer a slow, agonizing death, a death that would serve as a warning to anyone who dared to cross Jed. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed through the silent night. The desert wind carried his laughter away, a chilling testament to the darkness that had consumed him. He was no longer a bounty hunter. He was a man possessed, driven by an obsession that would lead him down a path of destruction. He had lost sight of the money, the debt. Now it was all about Sarah. She was the prize, and he would claim her, no matter the cost. The black feather, a silent omen, lay forgotten in the dust. The rising sun cast long shadows across the canyon walls as Ben surveyed the landscape. He'd chosen this place carefully, a narrow, winding gorge carved deep into the earth, a natural trap. The wind howled through the crevices, carrying whispers of danger and despair. It was a place where the earth itself seemed to conspire against intruders. He glanced back at Sarah, who was hidden amongst the rocks, her face pale but resolute. He'd told her to stay put, no matter what. He knew Jed would be relentless, but he also knew that Jed's obsession lay with her. If he could draw Jed away, lure him into this canyon, he might have a chance to even the odds, to buy Sarah the time she needed to escape. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder, his movements deliberate and practiced. He'd stripped down to the bare essentials: rifle, knife, canteen, and a handful of cartridges. He knew he couldn't outgun Jed's men, but he could outsmart them. He knew this canyon like the back of his hand, every twist and turn, every hidden crevice. He took a deep breath, the dry air stinging his lungs. It was time. He stepped out into the open, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. He fired a single shot into the air, the sound echoing through the canyon, a clear and unmistakable challenge. He didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, he heard the thunder of hooves, the shouts of men. Jed and his posse were coming. He smiled grimly. The trap was set. He moved quickly, silently, disappearing amongst the rocks. He found a good vantage point, a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor. He waited, his senses on high alert, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Jed and his men rode into the canyon, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the landscape. They were wary, cautious, but driven by Jed's unwavering obsession. "Ben!" Jed shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Come out and face me. You can't hide forever." Ben remained silent, hidden in the shadows. He watched as Jed's men spread out, their rifles at the ready. They were like wolves, circling their prey, closing in for the kill. He waited until they were within range. Then he opened fire. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the sound bouncing off the walls, creating a disorienting and deafening roar. He picked off Jed's men one by one, his shots precise and deadly. He aimed for the horses, crippling them, forcing the riders to dismount. He used the terrain to his advantage, moving quickly from one position to another, making it impossible for Jed's men to get a clear shot. Jed roared with frustration, his face contorted with rage. He urged his horse forward, determined to confront Ben. He knew this was a trap, but he couldn't resist the urge to face his adversary, to settle the score. Ben watched as Jed approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. He knew Jed was a desperate man, a man consumed by his own demons. He knew that there was no reasoning with him, no negotiating. The only way to stop him was to kill him. He took aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. But then he hesitated. He saw something in Jed's eyes, a flicker of humanity, a glimmer of regret. He couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. He lowered his rifle, his heart heavy with doubt. He knew he was making a mistake, that he was giving Jed a chance to strike back. But he couldn't kill a man in cold blood, not even a man like Jed. Jed seized the opportunity, spurring his horse forward, charging towards Ben's position. He raised his rifle, his eyes filled with hatred. Ben braced himself for the impact, knowing that he had made a fatal error. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. A rock slide, triggered by the relentless gunfire, cascaded down the canyon wall, burying Jed and his horse in a torrent of stone and debris. The canyon fell silent, the only sound the wind whistling through the rocks. Ben opened his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at the pile of rubble, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Jed was gone, crushed beneath the weight of the canyon itself. It was an act of nature, a twist of fate, a moment of divine intervention, or perhaps, Ben thought, it was simply the canyon claiming its due. He knew he couldn't stay here. Jed's remaining men would regroup. They would be looking for revenge. He had to find Sarah. He had to get her to safety. He scrambled down from his vantage point, his body aching, his spirit weary. He found Sarah where he had left her, huddled amongst the rocks, her face streaked with tears. She rushed towards him, throwing her arms around him, her body trembling with relief. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought you were dead." He held her close, his heart filled with gratitude. He had risked his life to protect her, and he had succeeded. But he knew that their journey was far from over. They still had a long way to go, and many dangers to face. He looked into her eyes, his gaze filled with determination. "We need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "They'll be back." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with trust. She knew that Ben would lead her to safety, that he would protect her no matter what. She took his hand, and together they disappeared into the vast and unforgiving landscape, leaving the canyon behind, a silent testament to the price of obsession and the enduring power of sacrifice. The stone in her pocket, warmed by her hand, felt like a promise of hope amidst the desolation. They were alive for now, and that was all that mattered. The echoes of the rock slide still reverberated in Sarah's ears, a symphony of destruction that mirrored the chaos in her heart. She clung to Ben, drawing strength from his presence, but a new resolve had taken root within her. Fleeing felt wrong. Running felt like surrendering to the fear that had haunted her since redemption. She wouldn't be a damsel waiting to be rescued. She would fight. As Ben began to lead her away from the canyon, Sarah gently pulled back. "Wait," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Ben stopped, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it, Sarah?" "We need to go." "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," she said, her gaze meeting his. "Jed's men will be back and they'll be angry. We need to be ready." Ben hesitated, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "It's too dangerous, Sarah. I can handle them. Your safety is my priority." "My safety is helping you," she countered, her voice rising with conviction. "I'm not helpless, Ben. I've learned a few things since redemption. I can fight." She saw the doubt in his eyes, the ingrained instinct to protect her, but she also saw a flicker of understanding. He knew she was serious. He knew she wouldn't back down. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he conceded, "but you listen to me. You do exactly as I say. No heroics." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Deal." They moved quickly, silently, back into the canyon, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Ben used his knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, leading Sarah to a narrow crevice high above the canyon floor. It was a hidden vantage point, offering a clear view of the entrance and the surrounding area. "This is where we make our stand," Ben said, his voice low. "We'll use what we have to slow them down, to give us a chance to escape if we need to." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the landscape. She noticed a pile of loose rocks precariously balanced on the edge of the crevice. An idea sparked in her mind. "Ben," she said, pointing to the rocks, "if we can trigger a small rock slide, we can block the canyon entrance. It will buy us some time." Ben's eyes lit up with understanding. "Good thinking," he said, "but it's risky. We'll need to be precise." They worked together, carefully dislodging the rocks, creating a makeshift trigger mechanism using a length of rope and a strategically placed branch. It was a crude but effective trap, designed to unleash a torrent of stone and debris upon anyone entering the canyon. While Ben set up the rock slide trap, Sarah gathered what few supplies they had left, some dried meat, a canteen of water, and the rifle. She checked the ammunition, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. She might not be a gunslinger, but she knew how to handle a rifle. She had learned that much from necessity. As they waited, the silence in the canyon was thick with tension. The wind howled through the crevices, carrying whispers of danger and anticipation. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was no longer the frightened widow running from her past. She was a survivor, ready to defend herself, and the man who had risked everything to save her. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. Just when they thought Jed's men might have given up, they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. "They're here," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get ready!" Sarah took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She gripped the rifle tightly, her finger resting on the trigger. She focused on her breathing, trying to calm her racing heart. Jed's men rode into the canyon, their faces grim, their eyes filled with vengeance. They were fewer in number than before, but they were still a formidable force. They spread out, their rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of Ben and Sarah. As they reached the narrowest point of the canyon, Sarah pulled the rope. The rocks cascaded down the canyon wall, a deafening roar filling the air. The rock slide caught Jed's men by surprise, burying several of them under a pile of stone and debris. Horses screamed, men cried out in pain and confusion. Ben opened fire, picking off the remaining men with deadly accuracy. Sarah joined in, her shots finding their mark with surprising precision. They worked together, a well-oiled machine, their movements coordinated and efficient. The remaining members of Jed's posse, panicked and disoriented, retreated from the canyon, leaving their fallen comrades behind. Ben and Sarah had won the first round, but they knew it wasn't over. Jed's men would be back, and they would be even more determined to exact their revenge. They had bought themselves some time, but they needed to use it wisely. As the sun set, casting the canyon in a cloak of darkness, Ben and Sarah slipped away, disappearing into the vast and unforgiving landscape. They left behind a scene of chaos and destruction, a testament to their resilience and their unwavering determination to survive. The stone in Sarah's pocket was cool against her skin, a reminder of the courage she had found within herself, a courage that had saved them both. They were no longer running from Jed. They were fighting back. And that, Sarah knew, made all the difference. The cold desert night offered little comfort. Sarah shivered, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter around her. They'd put miles between themselves and the canyon, but the echoes of gunfire and the image of Jed's men scattering still played vividly in her mind. Ben had built a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. He was silent, as usual, meticulously cleaning his rifle, his movements betraying none of the exhaustion he must have felt. Sarah watched him, a newfound appreciation blossoming in her chest. He had saved her life, not once, but twice. He had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. She wondered what drove him, what secrets he kept hidden beneath his stoic exterior. She cleared her throat. "Ben," she began, hesitant. "Thank you for everything." He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile, but there was a warmth in his gaze that spoke volumes. "You held your own back there," he said, his voice gruff. "You're tougher than you think." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I surprised myself," she admitted. "I never thought I was capable of that." "We're all capable of more than we realize," Ben replied, his gaze returning to his rifle. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. Sarah knew she couldn't keep running. She couldn't keep dragging Ben into her troubles. She needed to face her past, to confront the demons that had been haunting her for so long. "Ben," she said again, her voice more determined this time, "I need to tell you something. About Jed. About why he's after me." Ben stopped cleaning his rifle, his attention fully focused on her. He waited patiently, his silence encouraging her to continue. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "The inheritance," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The reason Jed thinks I'm worth so much. It's a lie." Ben's brow furrowed. "A lie?" Sarah nodded. "My family, they weren't good people. My father was a cruel and selfish man. When my husband died, leaving me with nothing, they saw an opportunity to get rid of me. They spread rumors about a vast inheritance, hoping to attract a wealthy suitor, someone who would take me off their hands. She paused, her voice choked with emotion. It was all a game to them, a way to wash their hands of me. I had nothing. My husband's debt was all that remained, and Jed was a convenient tool for them. Ben remained silent, absorbing her words. He didn't seem surprised, as if he had suspected something all along. Jed doesn't know the truth, Sarah continued. He believes the rumors. He thinks I'm hiding a fortune. But I'm not. There's nothing to be found. She looked at Ben, her eyes pleading. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for dragging you into this. You deserve better. Ben reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was gentle, reassuring. It's not your fault, he said, his voice soft. You were just trying to survive. He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. We'll deal with Jed, he said. We'll tell him the truth. And if he doesn't believe us, we'll make him believe us. A glimmer of hope flickered within Sarah's heart. With Ben by her side, anything seemed possible. The next morning, they rode towards redemption. It was a gamble, a risky move, but Sarah was determined to confront Jed, to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. They found him at the saloon, nursing a drink, his face bruised and sullen. His remaining men were huddled around him, their expressions a mixture of fear and resentment. Ben and Sarah walked into the saloon, their presence immediately silencing the room. Jed looked up, his eyes widening in surprise and anger. Well, he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who decided to crawl out of their hole. I was wondering when you'd show your faces. Ben stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Jed. We're here to talk, he said, his voice calm but firm. Talk? Jed laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. I'm done talking. I'm here to collect what's mine. You're not going to get anything, Sarah said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. Because there's nothing to get. Jed's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? Sarah took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. The inheritance, she said. It's a lie, a rumor spread by my family to get rid of me. There's no fortune, Jed. There never was. Jed stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. You're lying, he spat. You're trying to trick me. I'm not lying, Sarah insisted. Ask anyone in Redemption. They'll tell you the same thing. My family was cruel. They didn't care about me. They just wanted me gone. She stepped closer to Jed, her eyes meeting his. I'm not worth anything, Jed, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. I'm just a widow with nothing to her name. Jed looked from Sarah to Ben, then back to Sarah again. He saw the truth in her eyes, the pain and desperation that had been hidden beneath her facade. He saw the unwavering support in Ben's gaze. He hesitated, his expression slowly changing from anger to realization. He had been chasing a ghost, a phantom fortune that didn't exist. He had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a cruel family drama. The humiliation washed over him, a bitter wave of defeat. He had risked everything, lost men, and nearly lost his life, all for nothing. He slammed his fist on the table, sending glasses flying. Damn you, he roared, his voice filled with rage and frustration. Damn you all! He stormed out of the saloon, his men following close behind. He didn't look back. He didn't say another word. As Jed disappeared into the dust, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. She turned to Ben, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for believing me, for standing by me. Ben smiled, a rare and genuine smile that lit up his face. We're not done yet, he said. We still have a long journey ahead of us. He took her hand, and together they walked out of the saloon, leaving redemption behind. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they would face it together. The West was still wild, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The stone in her pocket felt warm, a symbol of her resilience, her courage, and the unwavering bond she had formed with the silent rancher who had saved her life. They rode towards the setting sun, two figures silhouetted against the vast and unforgiving landscape, their destinies intertwined. The dust of redemption settled behind them, but the weight of the past lingered. They rode for days, seeking a place to simply stop. The vast emptiness of the plains began to feel less like a threat and more like an invitation to start over. One evening, they stumbled upon a ghost town, not a bustling place that had faded, but a place that seemed to have been stillborn, a scattering of weathered buildings, a dried-up well, a church with a caved-in roof. It was a place forgotten, swallowed by the land. Sarah felt a strange pull. Maybe it was the desolation, mirroring the emptiness she'd carried for so long. Maybe it was the complete absence of any other soul, offering a chance to truly define themselves. "What do you think?" she asked Ben, her gaze sweeping over the dilapidated buildings. He dismounted, his eyes assessing the structures with a practiced eye. He tested the wood of a leaning porch, kicked at a pile of rubble. After a long silence, he simply nodded. "It's a start," he said, and so they stayed. They started small, clearing debris from the least damaged building, a small, sturdy structure that had once been a general store. Days bled into weeks, filled with back-breaking labor. They patched the roof, reinforced the walls, and cleared out the accumulated dust and debris. Ben, with his quiet strength and practical skills, seemed to know instinctively what needed to be done. Sarah, fueled by a newfound determination, worked alongside him, her hands growing calloused, her body aching, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. They spoke little, their communication a language of shared glances and understood gestures, but in the silence, a connection deepened. A bond forged not in pity or obligation, but in mutual respect and shared purpose. As the general store slowly transformed into a livable space, Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of home she hadn't known since childhood. She decorated the interior with salvaged items, a faded quilt, a chipped teacup, a small, hand-carved wooden bird she found in the ruins of the church. These small touches, reminders of beauty and resilience, transformed the bare room into a sanctuary. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah noticed Ben studying her. His gaze was intense, searching, but not unkind. "You seem different," he said, his voice hesitant. Sarah smiled. "I am different," she replied. "I'm not running anymore." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "You helped me find my strength, Ben. I don't know how to thank you." He simply shook his head. "You found it yourself," he said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn book. He handed it to her. Sarah took the book, her fingers tracing the faded title. "A primer?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. Ben nodded. "You said you used to read," he said. "Thought you might want to start again." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears. She hadn't read in years, not since her husband had scoffed at her frivolous pursuits. The thought of rediscovering that world, of opening herself up to new ideas and possibilities, filled her with a sense of exhilaration. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." And so, Ben began to teach her to read again. Each evening, after a long day of labor, they would sit by the fire, the flickering flames illuminating the pages of the primer. Ben, with his patient and gentle guidance, helped her to decipher the words, to unlock the stories hidden within. Sarah, in turn, rediscovered the joy of learning, the power of language, the magic of imagination. As her reading skills improved, Sarah began to share stories with Ben, tales of faraway lands, of brave heroes and daring adventures. He listened intently, his stoic face softening with amusement or interest. She sensed that he, too, longed for something more than the harsh realities of their isolated existence. One day, Sarah stumbled upon a small patch of fertile soil near the old well. An idea sparked in her mind. "Ben," she said, her eyes shining with excitement, "what if we planted a garden?" Ben looked at her, his brow furrowed. "A garden? Here? The soil's no good, Sarah." "We can try," she insisted. "We can amend the soil, find some seeds. It would be nice to have something green." Ben hesitated, then nodded. "All right," he said. "We can try." Together, they worked the soil, digging, tilling, and preparing the ground. They found some old seeds in the ruins of the general store, beans, carrots, and a few withered herbs. They planted them carefully, watering them with the precious water they drew from the well. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, miraculously, the seeds began to sprout. Tiny green shoots emerged from the earth, reaching towards the sun. Sarah tended to the garden with unwavering care, nurturing the fragile plants, protecting them from the harsh elements. As the garden flourished, Sarah felt a sense of hope blossom within her. It was more than just a garden. It was a symbol of their resilience, their determination to create a new life in this desolate place. It was a testament to the power of hope, the beauty of nature, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah looked at Ben, her heart overflowing with gratitude. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her partner, her friend, her confidant. He was the man who had helped her to heal, to rediscover her strength, to find her place in the world. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that she had never seen before. "Thank you, Ben," she said, her voice soft but sincere, "for everything." He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "We're in this together, Sarah," he said. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the deserted town, Sarah and Ben stood side by side, their hands clasped together. They looked out over the vast and unforgiving landscape, their hearts filled with hope and anticipation. They had found a place to belong, a place to heal, a place to build a future together. The stone in Sarah's pocket, now smooth and worn from constant contact, felt like a promise of a love built not on pity or debt, but on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the quiet strength of two souls finding solace in the vastness of the West. They were home,